weeks ago, some friends of ours were with us, and they were remarking that when they think about Katie, my wife, and I, they say, "Do you know, we've never heard you say a cross word." Well, that's a lovely comment for them to make. They obviously don't know us as well as we know ourselves. It's perhaps a bit of an exaggeration. However, it is true that from time to time we can get cross and we can say the wrong words, but I want to talk to you about a cross word today. It's a cross word in two respects. The word atonement has to do with an angry God, a God who has a righteous anger, a hatred for the things that are done wrong and that are opposite to his holiness. And it's also a cross word because the solution to that problem for mankind generally, and you and me in particular, is the cross of Jesus Christ, the place where he was pinned on a cross of wood to die, and to die as a substitute for you and for me. And that's basically what atonement is all about. Now, what I plan to do in this time that we've got available to us today is to just review with you what the meaning of the word atonement is and what its impact should be on us. So the first way to find its meaning would be to think about the English word atonement. It's not exactly a word that you hear used every day, is it? And so we'll have to think about how we're going to find a definition in the English language for that word. But we don't want to stop there. We want to think about it as a Bible concept, atonement. And therefore we're going to have to go back into our Bibles. And then we're going to realize that in the Old Testament of our Bibles, that part of the Bible was originally written mainly in the Hebrew language. And they had a word which is translated into our English Bibles as atonement. We want to examine that a little bit and find out its meaning and its shades of meaning, because it'll be helpful for us to understand the term better. So our plan to study it today is to first define the English word atonement, then to look at occurrences of a Hebrew word that's translated by the English word atonement, and then to look in the New Testament and see when a Greek word is used and translated from the original writings and used to express atonement and the concept of atonement in the New Testament. And then we want to consider together with you an example of how Jesus used the matter of the atonement in a parable that he stated to his hearers in his day when he was here on earth. And then we'll think about what the purposes of God were in the atonement that he has provided. So that's our plan of attack for this study. What does the English word mean then? Atonement. For centuries, people thought that the easiest way to think about it was to break up that English word and say at-one-ment. When we say ment, M-E-N-T, at the end of an English word, that just means being. So if a train goes off the tracks, it's a derailment, being derailed. If we're locked up in a room, it's a confinement, being confined. And atonement, being at one, is the way that it was expressed. And you'll find that in your English dictionary, whichever one you care to use. At-one-ment, being at one, bringing agreement to previously parties that were previously in disagreement. So that's the typical English understanding of it. Now, the world at large struggles with the word atonement to know exactly what it means and how it's brought about. So it's important for us to know what we're talking about and to base what we say about the word on what's found in the Bible. So without more ado, I think what I need to do is look at this Old Testament word and its occurrences in the Old Testament of our Bible. The word itself in the Hebrew language is a word that sounds like the English word for fish, kippur, a Hebrew word. And we're going to find out what it means by looking at some of its occurrences. So let's look at the first one in Genesis chapter 6 and verse 14. I'll put it up on the screen so you can read it from the screen. What it says is, "Make yourself an ark of gopher wood, make rooms in the ark and cover it inside and out with pitch." So God is talking to Noah about building the ark. It's going to be made of wood, so it should float, but it's going to have to be seaworthy against a real deluge, and he tells him to cover it inside and outside with pitch. If he told Noah about the scale of the deluge that was coming, Noah would want to make sure that that covering made the boat secure. And so it was covered inside and outside with pitch. I imagine it would look black from the outside. Because the word cover is the Hebrew word that's in other places translated as atonement. The word cover it with pitch is atone it with pitch. Make atonement for it in pitch. Give it a covering of pitch. And it doesn't just mean a cover, really. It means thoroughly cover it. So that's the essential meaning of the Hebrew word. Now keep that in your mind, and we'll go on to another one. And again, we'll put it up on the screen for you to read on the screen. It's from Exodus chapter 32, verses 30 to 32, and it says, "The next day Moses said to the people, 'You have sinned a great sin, and now I will go up to the Lord. Perhaps I can make atonement for your sin.' So Moses returned to the Lord and said, 'Alas, this people has sinned a great sin. They've made for themselves gods of gold. But now if you will forgive their sin, well, if not, please blot me out of your book that you have written.'" So can you see the concepts that are coming in from which we can learn a fuller meaning for the word atonement? More than just an agreement between individuals, which would be satisfied by the word reconciliation. No, atonement means essentially a covering, and a covering that we need when we sin, because God, in his righteous anger against sin, is completely just if he were to punish us for what we have done. And we need a substitute. And Moses here, in this early account in the Old Testament of the Bible, is showing us what atonement involves. A big, big cost that has to be paid by one person on the behalf of another. You notice it says make atonement for sin here. Atonement assumes that there's a sinful condition. It's not just bringing agreement between parties that have a minor difference. It's an issue that is requiring major action because sin is involved. So we'll come back to that as we look to another verse, Leviticus chapter 4, and see what it says there. And if we go down to verse 27, it says this: "If any one of the common people sins unintentionally in doing any one of the things that by the Lord's commandments ought not to be done, and realizes his guilt, or the sin which he has committed is made known to him, he shall bring for his offering a goat, a female without blemish, for his sin which he has committed. And he shall lay his hand on the head of the sin offering and kill the sin offering in the place of the burnt offering." And he goes on to say, "And the priest shall burn it on the altar for a pleasing aroma to the Lord, and the priest shall make atonement for him, and he shall be forgiven." So atonement can take place. There's a sin, and this is the way to deal with it. It was an unintentional sin. Maybe it was pointed out to the man after he'd done it. And he has to come and he has to bring his offering. Not just any offering. God prescribes exactly what is acceptable and the order and the process that's got to be followed. And if the person that's guilty follows all of these procedures in detail and brings this offering so that the priest can do what the priest has to do, then the priest will make atonement for him. And then you see what the result is. And he shall be forgiven. So we've been introduced to the concept of atonement. It's a thorough covering. It's needed because we have sinned against God, and God is right to be angry with us. And to deflect that anger, we need a substitute who will bear the punishment instead. And if we will accept that means that God provides to deal with the issues that our sin has caused, then the atonement can result. And if atonement is taking place, then we can be forgiven. Forgiveness is a product of atonement. Now let's go on. Later on in the book of Leviticus, you get the rules for the Day of Atonement. And see what it says here. It says in Leviticus 16 and verse 30, "For on this day shall atonement be made for you, to cleanse you. You should be clean before the Lord from all your sins." A covering, forgiveness, and the reconciliation that is then open when this forgiveness has taken place. And now we're learning that in addition to forgiveness, there's cleansing. this cleansing from all your sins. All of this captured in this term, atonement. Atonement is the thing that has to happen so that these positive results can occur. So now if you go into the next chapter in Leviticus, Leviticus 17, and down to verse 11, you learn something more about atonement. It says, "For the life of the flesh is in the blood, and I have given it for you on the altar to make atonement for your souls. For it is the blood that makes atonement by the life." And God says, I have given it on the altar to make atonement for your souls. Now, there's two things I want to notice there. I have given it. This is not something that a person can do for themselves. God had to be the giver of the process by which atonement would be made. God has to give life first so that he can restore life to the sinner who should lose it. And then he says, atonement for your souls. Last time it was atonement for sins. Sins was the cause that required atonement to be made. Now it's atonement for your souls. Now, you know and I know there's more to me and there's more to you than just this physical body. There's a whole lot of me that's expressed in an immaterial way. My emotions, my thinking, my mind. And people will generally agree about that. But when you look to the Bible, if you look in 1 Thessalonians 5 and verse 23, I think it is, it talks about you being comprising three things: body, soul, and spirit. Three things. Well, we know what happens to the body when you die. It just decays. Sometimes it's cremated, sometimes it's left to be buried in the ground, sometimes other things happen to it, but the body basically decays and dies after it dies. What happens to the spirit? It goes back to God who gave it. Well, what then happens to the soul? Well, that's the big question. I have to tell you, if you didn't already know, that you are eternal because God calls you a soul. God has given you a living soul. It's going to go on forever. Every human being is going to live forever. Whether they believe in the atonement that God has made for them or they don't accept it, they're still going to live forever. The question is, if they receive the atonement that God has made for them, they enjoy a forever of blessing. And if they reject it, then they suffer the consequences too. So let's bear that in mind before we go any further in this subject. Now, one final verse from the Old Testament scriptures before we turn to the New, and that's Proverbs 16 and verse 14. "A king's wrath is a messenger of death, and a wise man will appease it." You say, it doesn't say atonement in that verse. No, just like some of the others. It doesn't say the word atonement in the English version, but in the Hebrew version, it's exactly the same word. Kippur, 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 in each of these verses that we've been quoting to you. And here the word is translated into English, appease. Now you know what appeasement is. Turning away wrath. Turning away somebody's anger. A king's wrath is a messenger of death, says the proverb. You've done something that's angered the king, and the messenger that's coming after you is going to finish you off. But a wise man, he says, will appease it. You'll do something about the position that you're in. You'll appease it. You'll turn away the wrath. And so the word kippur, to cover thoroughly, we need a covering. We need a covering from God's anger, and we need a covering from the punishment that's due to us and that is coming our way. And the only way to deal with it is to change God's view about us. And the only way that can happen is by him providing a covering that is sufficient to take the punishment that was due to us and place it on a substitute instead. And that's what atonement is all about. Now, when we turn to the New Testament of the Bible, we don't find the word atonement mentioned very frequently. Some of the versions mention it once or possibly twice. There are only two places where the Greek word halaskamai, which translates the Hebrew word kippur into a Greek word, there's only two places where it occurs. Now, there are other words in the same word group that occur slightly more frequently. We're not going to get into those. Just the two places where the verb occurs: Luke 18 and verse 13, So Luke 18 verse 13 says, "But the tax collector, standing far off, would not even lift up his eyes to heaven, but beat his breast, saying, God, be merciful to me, a sinner." Now you say, there's no word for atonement there. Well, no, it's not translated atonement in most English versions. It's translated, be merciful to. Be merciful to me. And the man understood that he needed a covering for his sin, and he didn't deserve to be relieved of his punishment that was due. But he asked for God's mercy. Be merciful to me. God, make atonement for me, a sinner. And so we've learned these various different aspects, both from the Old Testament and the New Testament scriptures, of what all is involved in this term, atonement. And there's only one more to be quoted, and that's Hebrews chapter 2, verse 17, the final occurrence of the term atonement as a translation of the Hebrew word for that, where it's Hebrews chapter 2 verse 17, "Therefore he had to be made like his brothers in every respect, so that he might become a merciful and faithful high priest in the service of God, to make propitiation," or as the NIV or other versions may say, to make atonement for the sins of the people. Now we've moved from the individual, like the tax collector, to the whole group of people that Christ is going to deal with, his people, God's people. And they need a covering from the anger of a righteous God. And he's the one, a merciful and faithful high priest, who will be not only their advocate for the Father individually, but their great high priest on behalf of all the people of God, to provide that divine protection by the means of offering to God the substitutionary sacrifice that completely meets the need, once for all done by Christ. Now what I want to do next, just to spend a few minutes with you looking at a parable that Jesus spoke, and I think it illustrates atonement, even though the word's not mentioned in it. Here in the parable, it's the king who sends out the invitation. You can't invite yourself to the king's feast for his son. The king, how does he feel about all of this? Well, he's got these wonderful thoughts about his son, and he wants others to share them with him, share an appreciation of all that his son means to him, and especially on this special occasion, this wedding feast. But other people don't share that appreciation, and they reject the invitation. But they can't invite themselves to the feast. It's all reliant on him taking the initiative. Does that sound familiar in the matter of atonement? And so then we get to this aspect of the need for a right covering. So it's presented that the bad and the good are all receiving the invites, and they're appearing before God. And it looks as though, in accordance with the culture of the day, the normal thing at a wedding feast was for every person attending the feast to be given a wedding garment to wear, to enjoy the celebration together. And everybody's, if you like, equalized by wearing the same kind of wedding garment. And it's a picture of atonement again. It's a covering, isn't it? It's a covering that we all equally enjoy. None of us merit it. It's given to us. The king wants to see all of these people equally covered with the things that he's supplied. But one man appears who thought he could just manage alone. He didn't need that. And for him is reserved a place in outer darkness and a place of weeping and gnashing of teeth. The king is angry again. He's angry that people refuse his invitation, but he's even more angry that somebody would ignore the covering that he provides. It's a picture of atonement, isn't it? God knows that we are culprit sinners, but he has not left it that way. He has done something about it. He alone can make the invite to be restored to him through the substitutionary sacrifice that Christ has made on our behalf. And that will be our covering, our faith in what Christ has done in dying for us. And without that covering, we're exposed to the full wrath of an angry God. Things that arise as a result of atonement, they're sort of captured within the term. And I hope that this little review of the long word atonement has been revealing, and that you'll be thinking about where it fits with your life. Well, thank you very much for listening to this first in a series of studies on Bible words, important Bible words, big words with big meanings as we've introduced it. So we've looked at atonement today, and we've got several more words to look at over the next few weeks. So during November, we're hoping that each broadcast will be able to share with you some further thoughts on these important Bible concepts, expressed in relatively long English words, but words that have deep meaning for us all. So we hope that you enjoy them and that you'll come back again and watch our future broadcasts as we go through this series. We're looking forward, of course, to this season of the year, and there's plenty to think about as we approach Christmas time, and you'll be thinking along with us of the things that are different this year than experiences that we've had over past seasons. But we can all be very positive that because of what God has done, there's never a year that comes or goes that the sacrifice of Christ is not as present as before in all its effectiveness. We tend to remember his coming to earth as a baby, but we remember that he came in order to go to a cross as a man and die, to die as a substitute, as we've been learning today. And we'll be learning in future weeks about why he did it, to redeem us, to buy us back, to offer to God a propitiation, to take away God's anger towards us, righteous anger, but Christ has dealt with it and become our perfect substitute. And to think about how that we now stand not just as pardoned, but justified before God, so that he's able to look on us and to give us the things that he wants to give us, because our sins have been dealt with, and we're standing before him as Christ stands before him. And he is perfect and spotless, and God sees us in Christ, in him. And to think about how that should motivate us in lives of service to do more for the one who has done everything for us, given his own life, and offered himself to God so that he might redeem us. And if we're bought and paid for, and we're his property now, then that should be obvious in the kind of lives we lead. And those are what the Bible calls sanctified lives. And we'll deal with that in a final discussion, Bible study, on this topic as we go through November. So we look forward to meeting you again. We'll just put, as a reminder for you, the words that we're dealing with on a final screen, and that'll be followed by some contact details for any of you who want to get in touch with us. And since you've heard plenty enough of my voice, I think I should turn it over now to our singers to sing out the rest of this broadcast with you in a hymn that hopefully you'll know and one that you'll enjoy. So till next time, God be with you. Bye-bye.